He, of course, has also had very relevant contributions to the field of neuroscience and, of course, also computational neuroscience. He's the author of Parallel Distributed Computing, very famous book. He has extensively applied connectionist models to explain cognitive phenomena, and he has been an inspiration to a lot of continual learning methods. So very glad to have you here, and please, without further ado, I will give the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 kinds of learning in brains and machines. And I'm hoping to keep this to be open and simple presentation, and maybe engage in a discussion with people. Let me just start in, though, with some of the basic issues and kinds of learning and memory that I'd like to chat with all of you about. So I'm actually going to start with patient HM, who had a profound effect on the field of memory research, but also on my own thinking and perspective on how we learn and how we remember. And this slide is just a reminder of the lesion that HM sustained. So HM was a young man who was an epileptic patient who was profoundly epileptic, and previous surgeries, surgeons had removed the hippocampus on one side of the brain, but in the case of HM, they performed this surgery that you see here, not just on one side as shown, but on both sides, so that the hippocampus and the overlying cortex was removed not only on the right side of the brain, but also on the left. And quite surprisingly and unexpectedly, this produced a very profound set of preserved and deficient capabilities. So HM exhibited a profound deficit in forming new arbitrary associations and new episodic memories. Quite strikingly, you could have a conversation with him, talk to him for half an hour, perhaps. Then if you walked out of the room for 2 minutes and came back in, he would greet you as though he had never met you before. So clearly, this was a profound deficit in the ability to form new memories, and when tested on the ability to learn in psychological learning experiments, HM showed nearly completely at-floor learning abilities. On the other hand, he had a preserved ability to converse and reason about information held actively in mind, and he had a preserved short-term memory. In Brenda Milner's 1966 paper about HM, she talks about how he was able to keep the 3-digit series 584 in mind and think about them and recite them backwards and forwards to himself. And as long as he actively kept them in mind, he could use them to answer questions like, well, is there an 8 in the list? Yes. How about a 9? No. But you distract him from that and you give him something else to hold on to, and he doesn't remember that he was thinking about that series of 3 digits for, several minutes even. HM also lost recently learned specific information about why he was in the hospital, where he'd been prior to the surgery, and things like that. But he had preserved basic knowledge, acquired skills, and long-term remote memory. He could remember incidents from his own childhood. He could tell you who the presidents of the United States had been up until shortly before the time of his surgery. And he had, the preserved ability to converse in his native language, English, and to read and to write and to do things of that kind. Finally, he also exhibited the preserved ability to gradually acquire new skills and response tendencies and to show subtle single presentation priming effects. So if he, for example, was shown a line drawing of an object, he would be able to recognize the object from a smaller number of fragments of that same line drawing if he was shown that line drawing again than he would have been if he had never seen it before. And Milner, in her early papers, documented these findings about HM repeatedly and very clearly. So these findings, together with early explorations that I did with neural networks, deep learning systems that use backpropagation, got me thinking about what my colleagues and I called complementary learning systems theory. And there are some relationships between these ideas and some of Steve's ideas. But let me describe them in the way that we have laid them out in our work. So we think of the brain as containing large populations of neurons throughout the neocortex, and massive pathways connecting these neurons to each other, both within and between brain areas. And in this diagram, we sort of represented these sort of cortical neural networks and their connections with the little sort of green nodes that have arrows coming in and going out of them, perhaps linking these sort of higher level association kind of areas in the frontal and parietal and temporal cortices to more basic sensory areas and to each other. And we think of the knowledge that we acquire gradually over a lifetime of experience as being stored in the connections among these neurons, in these cortical neural networks. I don't mean to exclude subcortical structures, perhaps like the basal ganglia and so on, but primarily we focused on the neocortex because we know that lesions in specific parts of the neocortex destroy representations of certain aspects of sensory and more higher order representations. And so we think of them as being the primary place where the patterns of activation that underlie our explicit cognitive states are found, and we think of the connections among those neurons as being the ones that allow, for example, a spoken word to give rise to a mental image of the object that the word refers to. And HM had the ability to, recognize objects and say what their name was, or tell you what a dog was like from having seen a picture of a dog. And so we think HM, had these cortical networks intact. We also think that the data from Milner's experiments strongly suggest that the medial temporal lobe, here represented in gray, must be a rapid learning system, a part of the brain that is able to learn new things rapidly based on one or a small number of presentations, maybe with only one presentation. If we actively rehearse, of course, with a single overt presentation, we get multiple internal rehearsals, and this results in sufficient storage to retain some information for a moderate period of time. But the basic idea is this system learns much more quickly to form connections between patterns of activation distributed throughout the cortex so that we can have a record of our experience at a particular moment in time, which we would consider to be an episodic memory. Right now in this experiment, the experimenter showed me the word dog, and I thought about a particular dog that I owned, and I could form some sort of reduced description of that in my medial temporal lobe and store it in adjustments of connections between the neurons in the medial temporal lobe. In order for this to work, of course, we're going to need bidirectional connections, which we've shown here in blue, between the neocortical association areas and this medial temporal lobe area that allows patterns of activation in the cortex to be projected into the hippocampus and then serve as like retrieval cues to bring previous mental states back to mind. And that, of course, happens through the learned connections within the hippocampus, as well as through the return connections along the blue arrows back to the cortical areas. So if I had a hippocampus, unlike HM, if you said, what was that sequence of 3 digits I told you about before? You'd be able to say, oh yeah, that was 584. And that would depend on your hippocampus having stored a representation of that prior experience. So that's our overall theory. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to talk about how I've been thinking about this theory in the context of contemporary deep learning models. As Steve reviewed in his talk, and as I'm sure most of you know, deep learning models are based on backpropagation using gradient descent, but they come in many different varieties. And over the last few years, the large language models have become extremely dominant and have captured everyone's attention and interest. And these models actually employ a major new innovation, which I think is relevant to understanding HM and also our own memory capabilities and some of the current strengths and weaknesses of these large language models. So I want to just briefly kind of remind everybody or tell you about it if you're not super familiar with it, about the fundamental mechanism that today's large language models employ. To me, this is a major innovation in neural networks. And of course, it does lie at the heart of the success of models like GPT-4 in actually being able to perform the way they do. So essentially, the big innovation is this. The models process streams of words. In this case, I have a short stream of words like John hit the ball with the, and now we have the next word in the sequence, bat. The word bat is ambiguous. It could refer to a small flying animal or to something that you might use to hit something with. And what the large language model does is it essentially issues queries from the input word that allow it to canvas everything in the previous context that's already there. In this case, John hit the ball with the, and to ask questions essentially about the contents of its in context memory, if you like, this set of previous tokens in the current text string. In this case, I imagine that the query is asking, what's the verb in the preceding text? Because if the verb is hit, that might tell you that this is something you would hit something with. If it was fly, it might tell you that this is a small flying mammal. And the way this mechanism works, the query, we take a dot product between the query and all the vectors representing the different items in context. Where there's a strong dot product there, we get a high similarity value. And then we assign a high weight to that memory. And then what we return from memory is the weighted return vector, weighted all over all the items in the context of the goodness of match of the query to the item in memory, sort of weighting the returned vector from the memory system. Sometimes we separate, we have a query and then we have a key and a value that's returned. In this case, I'm thinking, well, the queries could be thought of as being any part of a vector stored in memory, and what we would retrieve would be the completion of that vector, a little bit like pattern completion, as we've often thought about it in the retrieval of information from the hippocampus or in hop-field network style memory systems. Okay, so this innovation allows contemporary deep learning models to essentially use information in context to condition its predictions and subsequent actions in a way that might be something that will turn out to be useful as we try to understand our own learning and memory systems and how to build better neural network based artificial systems. So just to put us all on the same page with this, we have this architecture. It's actually a complicated neural network architecture in which we have many, many sort of copies of this module that was first introduced in the Vaswani et al. Paper. And each of these modules of this architecture involves a sort of a standard feed-forward neural network and this multi-head attention. And the previous slide, we showed just a single attention head, but as probably many of you know, there might be up to 96 or so different attention heads, each issuing queries to match keys of other items and then retrieve vectors or values from the memory to inform the transformer about how to interpret each of the current items and what output to generate in response to it. I myself have been very taken by the BERT model, in which we have many of these transformer modules all simultaneously querying each other so that every word within a sentence can be used to query every other word in the sentence, allowing for all the words to help disambiguate all of the other words within a sentence, so that perhaps you could have a sentence where all the words were ambiguous, but there was only one coherent interpretation across all of them that would emerge as you went through the recurrent process of iterating over several layers of this kind of transformer architecture. But the predominant architecture, the one in GPT, is actually a sort of a left to right one. So that means that as each new word comes in, we imagine that everything that preceded it is kind of like our in-context memory, and we're only issuing queries from the current word. to match the keys and retrieve values from preceding items in contexts. But this, again, is still a very, very powerful model and allows these models to be sensitive to a huge range of prior context. And, you know, models, this schematic is very approximate, of course, but tries to give a sense that, you know, these models can be of various scales. So the GPT-3 series allowed the input length to be up to 4,000 sort of word parts long of previous text tokens. And the transformer stack was 96 layers deep with 96 attention heads within each layer, which is an immense computing system already, perhaps achieving a sort of a brain scale size almost. In GPT-4, they were able to scale up the length of the context window to even larger, and some contemporary models have gone even beyond that. And we really don't know, of course, in detail what the rest of the system is like in GPT-4, but certainly it involves this transformer architecture. So I like to think that the transformer is sort of like the cortex and sort of like HM in that it's got this context window for the stuff that's in the immediate recent text. And as soon as you wipe that clean, it's completely lost that information. Of course, the transformer could learn by gradually updating the weights through repeatedly presenting text to it and gradually changing the strengths of the connections. And that is how these systems build up their connections in the first place. So it's very much like the cortex-like system that we think of in the complementary learning systems. But it's also got this interesting feature of having something like an active or working memory that can be used to store recent information and use that to do appropriate behaviors or answer questions based on information and context. Okay, so it's like HM in that it has its short-term memory as well as its gradual cortical-like learning system, but it doesn't have a medial temporal lobe-like learning system. So with that context, I thought it was really interesting when recently a paper came out describing a limitation of the cortex-like learning system, if you like, in transformer models. And this is a phenomenon known as the reversal curse. So this is what happens in a large language model if you try to teach it something new. And it's not the same as the catastrophic interference problem, which is a problem. When you try to teach these models something new, the better you teach them something new, the less well they do on other things that they previously had learned. And this is a known phenomenon. But the reversal curse is a new finding that I think is interesting and informative. So let me share that with you. The reversal curse is the finding that if you teach the neural network A is B, it won't actually know anything about the reverse of this. So let's consider an example. If you fine-tune your language model on facts that you've made up, they're not real facts, so you know they aren't already in it. You teach it that somebody named Daphne Barrington is the director of a journey through time. And then you ask the model, well, who is Daphne Barrington, it will say, oh, Daphne Barrington is the director of A Journey Through Time. But if you asked it, who directed A Journey Through Time, it has no clue. Okay, so that's the reversal curse. And I think that you and I would probably be able to answer the second question as well as the first question. Now, this is something that the network learned by fine-tuning its connection weights as through many, many repeated experiences with this and a body of other facts that they fine-tuned the network with after it had learned, as though we were consolidating this information into our cortex-like learning systems. It's not the same as using the information in context to make an inference. And the paper is clear in pointing out that, in fact, the reversal curse does not apply under those circumstances. And I've tested GPT 3.5 myself on this with my own little example, which I'll show you now. I went on to GPT-3 and I said hello, and it responded and said, hello, how can I assist you today? And I said, let us suppose that John is Bill's father and Fred is Ted's uncle. Who is John's son? So I didn't tell it anything about that, but it was exactly, I just told it that John is Bill's father, and it answered correctly, John's son would be Bill. And when I asked it, well, what is Fred's relationship to Ted? It got that right, but it also got the reversal question right. What is Ted's relation to Fred? Ted is Fred's nephew. And then what is Ted's relation to John, just to make sure that it isn't just spewing out things that just finding something in context. It said, well, Ted's relation to John is unclear, as it is not mentioned how John is related to Ted. And then I said, John and Fred are brothers. Now can you tell me Ted's relation to John? And it said, John and Fred are brothers, then Ted would be John's nephew. So this is actually pretty smart, right? The network is able to use this information when presented in context, use it bidirectionally, combine new facts together to make an inference, and correctly bind items to their roles and use them bidirectionally and not suffer from the reversal curse. I must report to you that it wasn't perfect. I actually left something out there when I asked it, who is Ted's nephew? It says Ted's nephew would be Fred, and that isn't quite correct. Fred, okay, or at least I think so. I find myself confused by these items, but Fred is Ted's uncle, so he can't also be his nephew, right? Okay, so nobody's perfect, not even me, but I think that the model is doing stuff that's pretty reasonable as far as using information in context to reason, but it's not able to use information that we interleave into its connection weights in as intelligent a way as we can. And this reminded me of a striking finding in medial temporal lobe amnesia, which is the finding that it was possible to teach a profoundly amnesic patient a set of new associations over repeated presentations, but the patient, they didn't exactly test the reversal curse, but they did test for a kind of generalization that normal subjects could do, but which the amnesic could not do. And so the examples were things like shark killed blank. Okay, so if I gave somebody this item like shark killed and asked them complete this, we'd get a range of possible responses. Maybe with some very low probability, the word octopus would be produced. And in fact, with control subjects and with the amnesic patient, with a bunch of these items, there's a very, very low base rate of correctly guessing the correct completion. So the amnesics and the controls were about the same in their ability to guess the correct completions to these items. A group of control subjects was able to learn these items with very few presentations. But interestingly enough, the amnesic subject was also able to learn, not as well and with much more repetitions, but there is definitely some gradual buildup of performance in the amnesic patient over several repeated presentations. And that's also exhibited in a forced choice test. Interestingly, and this is where it's related to, though not exactly the same as the retrieval curse finding, the patients could generalize to synonym versions of the previously learned items, whereas the hippocampal amnesic patient could not. So in this case, one of the items was venom caused, and I'm not exactly sure what the correct answer to what the venom caused was, but there was some correct answer to that question. Fever, I guess, yeah, that's shown in the caption here. And after a delay, the control subjects had shown forgetting of this, so that when given the original probe, they didn't recall fever as strongly as they only got it 30% correct, but they were equally good with the synonym version, which was poison-induced fever. Whereas the control subject only showed retention in the specific case of the exact item that had previously been studied. And I'm hypothesizing that we might see the same thing in our large language models. So my thought here is that the way we should think about our medial temporal memory systems is that they're capable of storing the kinds of representations that contemporary large language models are able to form and represent in context, and bring them back to mind to be able to use them in the same way that we use information that's directly available because it's still in context. And that these large language models actually give us a tool for beginning to explore this sort of characteristic that humans have, that most of the neural networks that I know of or that I've worked with myself over the years before the introduction of these large language models within context memory systems didn't exhibit. So I don't want you to think that I believe that the human brain is exactly like any of today's large language models. And in order to sort of illustrate that point, I'm going to briefly tell you about my own sort of way of thinking about the kind of model that I think might capture our own human-like cognitive system a little bit better than a language model just like GPT-4. And it's sort of like this. It has a neocortex-like system, which I've illustrated here in blue, which I'm imagining has a limited window of mutual constraint satisfaction. Maybe, you know, all the words within a single sentence can mutually constrain each other. So if you hear a sentence like, the eel of the shoe, you would think, oh, that word that had it in front of the eel part must have been heel. But if you heard the eel of the wagon, you might think it would have been wheel, or the eel of the fabric, you might have thought it was feel. So you could use the context bidirectionally to help you interpret all the words in context with the aid of each other. And also, with concomitant visual information, you might see objects in the world that would constrain your interpretation of what it is that somebody's talking about. And language, in turn, could also bidirectionally constrain and influence your interpretation of the objects you're seeing in the world. And this sort of bidirectional representation, together with a kind of a broader representation of the overall context or situation within which this information is being presented to you, would be the kind of thing that would be a cortex-like representation, which would then be stored in the medial temporal lobe learning system, sort of like the one I illustrated on the earlier slide, by rapid connection weight adjustments that would then be something we could bring back to mind and use at a later time if we were reminded about something that we had learned previously. So basically, this slide is just showing this idea, the limited sort of BERT-like mutual constraint satisfaction networks within and between brain areas in the cortical system, representing different types of information, and not just visual and auditory, but other sensory modalities as well, together with the medial temporal lobe system, which would allow fast learning, and then the bidirectional connections here shown in green that would allow projection of patterns into that for storage and queries to be used to retrieve information for later use. Yes, so that's my updated, slightly modified perspective on how we could take contemporary large language models and begin to build something more like a psychological model of the complementary learning systems that would actually capture the capabilities of these language models in a psychologically more realistic way and interface them with a medial temporal lobe-like learning system to have the capabilities that would allow us to avoid the reversal curse and use information in the sense of understanding it, which these in-context memories are beginning to provide, to overcome the limitations of direct in-weights learning. Yeah, so I will stop there and take your questions.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot for that very interesting presentation. I would remind everybody that the Q&A box is open, so please put your questions there. Maybe before we start, I would like to start with one question that I was having. So you described a lot of cases with amnesia, and my understanding is that with amnesic patients, it's very difficult for them to learn new information, which is a little bit the opposite situation that we have with forgetting in deep neural networks. Would you agree with this interpretation? Would you see sort of the process of trying to teach something to a patient with amnesia similar to a model that has little plasticity, or?
If you take one of these large language models and you, actually, I should be careful here. But I guess, let me just say this, okay? The models that I've worked with myself over the years are models that gradually acquire cognitive abilities. They gradually acquire the ability, let's say, to learn how to read, map from spelling to sound, let's say, or to retrieve, to complete the appropriate semantic associations of items that they've learned through repeated exposure in a deep multi-layer neural network-like learning system. And gradient-based learning is usually done in very large batches with a very small learning rate, so that the updates that occur when you have a single experience are slightly adjusting the weights in the network, but they're not teaching it some new thing rapidly, okay? You would need to repeat these items over and over again many times in order for them to be strongly encoded in the network's connection weights. So I think of that as being like what happened with that amnesic patient. With many repetitions of these new associations, the patient gradually began to learn them. And I believe that he was learning them in his cortex because he didn't have a fast learning, a medial temporal lobe-like learning system. If we had said to that patient, venom, I've forgotten the exact wording of that, but venom induces fever, and then what would you think I should say is the completion of poison causes? It might say, well, you said maybe the venom was the poison. So he would be able to use this information if it was active in his mind. But just like HM, if you distracted him with something else and came back and said, well, what was that? What did we just talk about? He was, I don't remember, right? He wouldn't have learned anything. He made little tiny adjustments to the connection so that after 24 repetitions over 12 weeks, there was a slight tendency for him to produce that response, but it was built up very gradually over repeated exposures. So hippocampal patients, like deep neural networks that I'm familiar with, learn very gradually over repeated updates. And if you force them to learn quickly by doing many, many repeated updates of just the same thing, that produces interference with what they know. And so the idea is that we don't do that. We don't learn that way. We learn by storing things in our medial temporal lobes in a form that we can bring back to mind. So I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that you might even remember that number that I mentioned twice before earlier in the conversation, that HM studied several times. Do you remember it?
The number of the HM study?
I mentioned an example number that HM studied.
No, I do not remember that.
Okay.
You will have to repeat that, please.
Our episodic memories aren't perfect, but the number was 584. Does it ring a bell now? No? Okay.
I mean, yes, would not have come to that.
The superficial details of the presentation for trying to track the idea. But if you, right. Okay, so I don't know where to go from here with this particular part of the conversation. Did I address your question at all?
Oh, yes, definitely. A long time ago, definitely. Okay. So I will move on to the next question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for this extremely inspiring talk and establishing the link between large language models and neuroscience. How can we interpret these parallels between humans and LLMs, despite differences in how learning is carried out? Can we think about the paralysis, about the parallels as some kind of universals about learning systems? What are the big questions for the future?
Okay. Well, thank you for telling me that you were inspired by my talk. I appreciate that. This is the question I'm asking myself. You're asking me the very question the kinds of questions I ponder, and I feel like a witness to this revolution where all these really amazing things are happening, and I think gradually we'll learn more and more about how to think about these things. It has been my argument for a very long time that there are parallels between the learning systems in human brains and artificial neural networks. And that's why I've been using artificial neural networks myself to simulate human learning since the late 80s. I can't say for sure what all of the crucial factors are, but I think the kinds of phenomena that these systems exhibit are phenomena that depend upon the fact that in a very deep multi-layer learning system where the output to any given input depends on many, many layers of connection weights between an input and an output, there's a very complicated coordination problem that has to be worked out in order to learn the input-output mapping. And, when you have just a single matrix of connection weights from a set of input units to a set of output units, there's profound limitations on what you can learn, but you can also learn whatever is learnable very fast. But once you have multiple layers, the gradient signals that derive learning in any one of the layers of the network depend on the connection weights that are already present in all the other layers of the network. And we have a paper, first author is Andrew Sachs, on exact solutions of the learning dynamics of deep linear networks, and a couple of other papers applying these ideas to understanding aspects of human semantic learning and development, where these are generic features of deep networks that have multiple layers of, essentially cascaded or concatenated connection weights that you have to go through from input to hidden to second hidden to output. Even with just one hidden layer, these phenomena begin to arise. And you see these very complex learning dynamics arising in those situations. It takes time for structure to begin to get acquired and to gradually be learned. And, once you've built it up, if you try to rapidly learn some new thing in there, you will indeed find you get interference with things that are similar that are already in the network and so on. So I think that there are theoretical ideas that we could work out in the context of, generic architectures that could be thought of as being things that could be used in AI, but also idealized examples of neural networks that might exist in our brain, and they would be subject to things that we can study. So this anonymous question about attention is very interesting. And I think we need to dissociate two forms of the word attention. So the query-based attention mechanism inside the neural network is actually, essentially completely automatic. It's learned into the connection weights. So it's not like there's some deliberate process of guiding one's thought. I think that we need to complement that mechanism with some deliberate process of guiding one's thought in order to truly capture our goal-directed learning and attention abilities. And your question does tap into that. And I think it's another thing that we need to work on, but not quite the same one as the one that I've been discussing here. Shall I take this last question? I know we're running.
Yes, and Kilian also has a question. So
okay,
you can answer this question briefly, then Kilian can ask his question, then we have a final question and we are done.
Okay, so Marty asks a very general question. Can you say anything about the extensibility of these types of networks to signals as opposed to text? Camila Gonzalez would like to answer that question. You want to answer that? No?
Of course not. I'm just trying to keep in line what we're doing here.
Okay.
Please go ahead. I can answer later.
Signals. I'm not sure what you might mean by signals here, but I would just say that, it's certainly my view that in our biological brains, we get signals through our skin surface about, okay, that object over there is my cell phone, and this one must be my keyboard because I feel, different shapes through my fingers, and those things produce patterns of activation that go into these networks that, then function in a similar kind of way, right? And I build a representation of the world around me. So, there could be two rectangular objects that are exactly the same as this one, but you could say, oh, that one's mine. Please don't take my phone. Yours is the one over there. And, that would be another source of information that I would use to build a representation of the situation in the world. And then, so I think, yes, absolutely. Do you want to apply these methods to EEGs? Well, that would not be so much to model the brain as to model the outputs of the brain in electrical signals. So I would leave that up to you.
I'll jump in. So one quick question that I've actually had for a really long time, and I think you might be poised to answer really well after I say, as predicted, no catastrophic interference. Your talk was excellent. So thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. So one question that I had for a really long time when I first started thinking about neural networks, because I come to this mainly from biology, where a key core concept in biology is structure equals function. So from proteins to, especially in neuroscience, they beat into your head that there is this structural organization of the brain. There are circuits in the brain, and that structure imposes the kind of cognitive function that we see. But when I first entered to learn about neural networks, especially like vanilla neural networks where everything's connected to everything, there seemed to be little architecture and little structure aside from the learn weights, and they kind of, you can set weights to 0 and the structure kind of comes out and emerges, but it's not explicitly given. But as time goes on and you start to see like these transformer architectures, and especially like the complementary learning systems architecture and what you were proposing later with LLMs, where you kind of have this hippocampal architecture in the cortex, it seems like as we impose more and more structure onto neural networks, we can kind of get them to do better things. So what is kind of your opinion on how much architecture do you think we need in neural networks? Do you think that really will help, or do you think it's mainly the statistical properties that deep learning and neural networks give us that drives more of the learning, or is it probably, as the answer always is with these things, a little bit of both?
Yeah, you've answered your own question, but the LLM, the transformer architecture did really change the capabilities of artificial neural networks to do interesting things with text, right? This is abundantly clear to me. And that just sort of points to the fact that architecture is relevant. And I also think that the structure of the data is incredibly important. So I think it's a yes and in a very strong kind of multiplicative sense, right? So whether I certainly do not feel that the immediate neural networks that people are working with right now in AI companies are sort of human-like neural networks like the ones in the biological brain. I do think it's exciting and interesting to imagine them as having this kind of query-based attention-like capability. And so one of the directions of the work that we've been doing has been to actually explicitly try to explore that. And that would be, a conversation that would take a few minutes to develop. But basically, there is one key feature of this, which I can hopefully mention briefly and give you the rough idea about how I'm thinking. So, as I described, these LLMs have all these slots in which you have each of the previous tokens of the text, like word parts. Sometimes they're whole words, sometimes they're parts of longer words, but they're just lined up there, and you've got up to 12 or even 32,000 of these things in this buffer, right? And the query gets to query all, let's say, 32,000 of these previous items in the context. They're all lined up there in separate slots. Clearly, our brains don't have any separate slots like that, right? People who argue that human short-term memory has exactly 4 slots in them, I mean, that at best that's a metaphor, and it's approximately true when we think about things. The more patterns you try to store in the system, the more they're going to start to interfere, and about 4 or 5 is where you start running into complications with that. That's the way I would want to think about it. So we don't have any fixed slots in our human memories, and we don't store individual items in single neurons. And this relates to one of the questions that was asked to Steve earlier, right? And in adaptive resonance, you're basically assigning one neuron to each item that you've ever seen before, and that's a powerful idea. It allows all the items to be stored and used as things that you can try to retrieve from, but we don't have slots like that, and we don't dedicate individual neurons. So what we're explicitly trying to do is to take models that start with this Grossberg idea, which many people have had models like this. You just specify that every experience you ever had is stored in another vector in memory, and then that's your theory of memory, right? It can't really be like that. So is there an alternative? Well, David Marr's original idea about how the hippocampus uses sparse distributed codes provides an alternative. And that's exactly what one of my students and I have been exploring. Can we simulate the slot-based models with, first replace the slots with single neurons, that are isomorphic to the slots, and then generalize that to a distributed representation, not involving a single neuron per memory, but each neuron is involved in, sparsely involved in multiple memories. We haven't shown that we can overcome, that those systems are superior, but at least they're comparable in certain ways to an explicit slot-based system. And so I think that that's a fertile domain for further research, and it'll get at the actual structure of the medial temporal lobe, which does appear to involve very sparse distributed representations in the inner layers of the hippocampus.
Yeah, it's biologically
very
plausible.
sparse architecture as well, as you know.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Well, since you referenced our previous speaker, unfortunately he had to leave when your session started, so he didn't get to, there was no opportunity for us to hear you interact. Is there maybe any questions that you would have liked to ask him for our audience to ponder on?
I thought that some of the questions that other people asked were similar to ones I would have asked myself, so I will leave it at that. I guess I will say that one of the things that I like about artificial intelligence research is that it's very strongly driven by, seeing what you have achieved so far and then noting where you have not yet fully achieved, and then setting that as the next target for development. So I think the reversal curse paper, which just came out, is an example of something where, somebody's found a bug, a feature, a characteristic of these models that clearly is counterfactual to the way we think intelligence should be. And then that gives us a actionable research item to study and progress on with the tools of all the tools of AI. And I think that people should be exploiting any of Steve's ideas that they find useful in, like, sort of addressing those kinds of identified issues and working towards building better systems. And I think that's the way we ultimately make progress.
And that's a very good point. I suppose catastrophic forgetting is also one of those bugs that was identified and we are trying to solve as well. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today. It was very informative.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yes.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.